And I'm very grateful that I've made it. I don't know how many people really get to live to see their dreams come true, but I have a good family, a good support system.
For nearly 6 decades, Carl Dean was the one constant Dolly Parton could always return to. He never chased the spotlight, rarely appeared beside her publicly, and seemed perfectly comfortable letting his famous wife command the world's attention. Then, on March 3, 2025, that private world changed forever. Carl died at 82, bringing an end to a marriage that had lasted almost 60 years. For Dolly, this wasn't simply losing a husband. It meant losing the person who had been beside her through virtually every chapter of her adult life. She continued working, smiling, and speaking to fans. But behind that familiar personality was someone dealing with an enormous absence. Months later, Dolly would openly admit that caring for Carl had caused her to put some of her own health needs aside. She had spent years taking care of everyone else, and suddenly there was no way to replace the person she had spent most of her life beside. But the real warning signs hadn't started with his death. Something else had already been developing quietly. By September 2025, fans received the first major indication that Dolly was dealing with more than ordinary exhaustion. She announced that her planned Las Vegas residency would be postponed because of health challenges. The wording immediately caught attention, but Dolly didn't provide a detailed diagnosis. Instead, she explained that her doctors wanted her to undergo several procedures and that she needed time to recover. It was classic Dolly, honest enough to acknowledge there was a problem, but reassuring enough to keep people from imagining the worst. She even made it clear that she still intended to return when she was ready. For a performer who had spent decades pushing through exhaustion, postponing shows was unusual. Fans naturally began asking what was really happening behind the scenes. Yet Dolly seemed determined to keep the mood light. At that point, most people had no idea that the health problems she was describing would become a recurring part of her final year. And then her own family made the situation even more worrying. In October 2025, the situation took an unexpected turn when Dolly's younger sister, Frida Parton, publicly asked people to pray for her. The message was brief, but coming from a close family member, it immediately caused concern. Fans began wondering whether Dolly's condition was much more serious than she had admitted. The reaction was strong enough that Dolly responded herself the following day. She tried to calm everyone down, explaining that she knew people were beginning to think she was far sicker than she actually was. Her response carried the warmth and humor fans knew so well, but something about the sequence was difficult to ignore. First came the public request for prayers. Then came Dolly's reassurance. It created a pattern that would repeat several times. Concern would rise, Dolly would step in to calm it, and then another health-related development would appear. At the time, there was no way for fans to know how important those moments would become. But the next revelation would stretch the timeline much further back. Dolly later explained something that changed how people viewed those months. She admitted that while caring for Carl during his illness, she had neglected some of her own health needs. It was an unusually personal confession from someone who had always been careful about separating her private life from her public career. For years, Dolly had built an image around strength, humor, faith, and relentless determination. She was the person who kept going when everyone else might have stopped. But losing Carl forced her to confront something she couldn't simply work through with another performance or another song. Her own body needed attention. The tragedy was that by the time she began focusing seriously on herself, several problems had already been developing. She later spoke about rebuilding herself emotionally, spiritually, and physically, revealing just how deeply the previous year had affected her. Still, she refused to let the public see her as defeated. She kept talking about future projects and returning to work. But beneath that optimism was a much longer medical story. One of Dolly's most revealing statements came when she explained that her immune system and digestive system had been struggling for 2 or 3 years. That detail changed everything. Suddenly, her health problems couldn't simply be viewed as something that began after Carl's death. Dolly was describing issues that had apparently been developing long before fans knew anything was wrong. She said she and her doctors were working hard to rebuild and strengthen her body, suggesting that this wasn't a single temporary setback. There were multiple things happening at once. Yet somehow, she continued to project the same Dolly Parton fans had always known: optimistic, funny, and determined to keep moving forward. That's what makes her final year so difficult to understand in hindsight. The warnings were there, but they arrived in small pieces, often softened by humor or reassurance. Nobody watching from the outside had the complete picture, and then Dolly finally revealed one of the most concrete and painful problems she had been dealing with: recurring kidney stones. In May 2026, Dolly finally gave fans one of the clearest explanations of what had been happening to her body. She revealed that kidney stones had been a recurring problem for years, and she described the experience with the kind of humor only Dolly could deliver. She joked that doctors had taken more stones out of her in a year than a rock quarry back home in Tennessee. The line made people laugh, but underneath the joke was a painful reality. This wasn't something that had happened once and disappeared. It was a condition she had apparently been managing repeatedly, while still trying to maintain an exhausting professional schedule. Dolly also acknowledged that her immune and digestive systems had been struggling, making it clear that several health issues were overlapping. She wanted fans to know she was receiving treatment and working with her doctors, but she also made something else obvious. She wasn't simply dealing with one minor setback. Her body had been demanding attention for some time. And if you're enjoying this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because the next part reveals why Dolly's health problems eventually forced her to change plans she had been building toward. But the kidney stones were only one piece of the puzzle. The kidney stone revelation became even more significant when Dolly discussed another problem she had been experiencing. She said her immune system and digestive system had gotten out of whack over the previous 2 or 3 years. That timeline was important because it showed that her health struggles didn't suddenly appear in 2025. They had been developing quietly while she continued recording music, managing businesses, appearing at events, and planning new projects. Dolly said she and her doctors were working hard to rebuild and strengthen both systems. She didn't present herself as someone giving up, quite the opposite. Her language suggested that she viewed recovery as another challenge to overcome. But there was a limit to how much determination could change what her body was telling her. Medication and treatment could affect how she felt from day to day, and eventually, those effects began interfering with her ability to travel and perform. For one of the most hard-working entertainers in history, that created a difficult choice: keep pushing forward, or finally admit that her body needed the priority. And her next decision showed which path she chose. Las Vegas had been part of Dolly's plans, but by 2026, those plans were no longer realistic. What had originally been postponed eventually became a cancellation. Dolly explained that some of the medications and treatments she was receiving could leave her feeling dizzy, and she didn't want to step onto a stage unless she could give audiences the performance they expected from her. That decision said a lot about her personality. She could have pushed herself through a few shows and relied on the strength she had displayed throughout her career. Instead, she recognized that performing while physically unwell could create an experience neither she nor her fans wanted. For decades, Dolly had been known for showing up with energy, humor, and complete confidence. Now she was being forced to accept that there were things she couldn't simply power through. Still, cancellation didn't mean she was ready to disappear. She continued thinking about music, business, Broadway, and other projects. Even while her health was limiting her movements, her imagination remained active. But soon, Another absence would become impossible for fans to overlook. Dolly's health problems were becoming harder to hide, but her creative ambitions never seemed to slow down. She continued working on projects connected to her music and her larger legacy. She had spent decades proving that she could turn an idea into something much bigger than anyone expected, and she wasn't about to abandon that instinct simply because her health had become complicated. There was also a deeper reason she kept creating. Dolly understood that her work could continue reaching people even when she wasn't physically present. Songs could be recorded, stories could be written, productions could be completed, businesses could keep operating. That mindset became especially important during her final months. Instead of allowing illness to become the only story surrounding her, she kept giving fans reasons to look forward. Yet there was one place where her absence carried unusual weight. Dollywood wasn't just another business with her name attached to it. It was deeply connected to her identity, her hometown roots, and her relationship with millions of visitors. When she couldn't appear there, people noticed immediately. And this time, Dolly had a very simple explanation. When Dollywood opened a new attraction in 2026, many fans expected Dolly to be there. After all, the park was one of the clearest extensions of her personality and legacy. But she didn't make the appearance. Instead, Dolly sent a message explaining that her doctor had advised her not to travel. She mentioned feeling dizzy and dehydrated, symptoms that might sound ordinary on their own. But context made them harder to dismiss. By then, fans already knew about the kidney stones, the immune and digestive problems, the treatments, and the emotional strain she had experienced after Carl's death. Dolly still spoke with warmth, refusing to make the message sound frightening. She reassured people while acknowledging that she needed to follow medical advice. For someone whose career had been built around showing up, even missing an event at Dollywood felt significant. It also demonstrated how much her circumstances had changed. She wasn't simply choosing to take a day off. Her doctors were now telling her when she should stay home. And only weeks later, the public would learn that the situation was far more serious than most people realized. The final weeks brought a change that was difficult to overlook. Dolly had already missed appearances, canceled plans, and spoken openly about several health problems. Yet she continued reassuring fans that she was doing her best and following her doctor's advice. She talked about feeling dizzy and dehydrated, and explained why traveling had become difficult. To many people, those symptoms still sounded manageable. Dolly herself had a way of making even serious situations sound less frightening. But there was something different about seeing her step back from events connected so closely to her own name. Her absence at Dollywood wasn't just a missed appearance. It showed that her health was beginning to dictate what she could and couldn't do. Behind the scenes, she was dealing with far more than one isolated problem. Years of health issues, ongoing treatment, and the emotional weight of losing Carl had all become part of the same final chapter. Still, she continued thinking about the future. She had projects in development and plans that stretched beyond the present moment. Nobody watching those updates knew just how little time remained. Then the news came that changed everything. On August 25, 2026, the world learned that Dolly Parton had died at 80 in Nashville. The announcement was delivered through a message recorded by her nephew, Brian Seaver, who had been part of her security team for years. What made the announcement especially emotional was the explanation that Dolly had asked him to record the message years earlier, long before anyone expected it would actually be needed. Suddenly, all those earlier health updates took on a different weight. The postponed performances, the kidney stone problems, the immune and digestive difficulties, the dizziness and dehydration. None of those details had prepared fans for the possibility that Dolly's story was nearing its final page. Reports later indicated that she had been hospitalized shortly before her death. But even then, the public still didn't have the complete medical picture. Dolly had always controlled how much of her private life she shared, and that remained true until the end. Then came the information that answered the biggest questions surrounding her death. The cause of Dolly's death eventually became clearer, but not every detail was released. Her representatives confirmed that she had been battling cancer before her death. The revelation changed the way many people looked back at the final months. Suddenly, the repeated references to health challenges were no longer simply vague warnings. There had been a much more serious medical battle happening behind the scenes. But it's important not to fill in gaps that her family hasn't filled themselves. The specific type of cancer has not been publicly disclosed, and there is no reliable basis for claiming that kidney stones caused her death. Dolly had openly discussed kidney problems and other health struggles, but those conditions should not be presented as the cause unless her family or medical representatives confirm it. What we do know is that she was dealing with cancer while continuing to protect her privacy and reassure her audience. That makes her final public messages feel especially poignant. She wasn't giving fans every detail. She was choosing what she wanted them to know. And that decision tells us something important about Dolly herself. Dolly had spent her entire career making difficult moments feel lighter. That instinct didn't disappear when she became sick. Even while discussing medical problems, she often used humor, warmth, and optimism. She didn't want every conversation to become a discussion about illness. She wanted people to focus on the music, the projects, the children receiving books, and the future she was still building. That may be one reason her death felt so sudden. Fans had heard that she wasn't feeling well, but they had also heard Dolly reassure them. She was still talking about projects. She was still thinking about the next chapter. She still sounded like someone who expected tomorrow to arrive with another plan. Looking back, however, the pieces tell a more complicated story. She had been dealing with health issues for years, and by 2026, those problems were affecting where she could travel and what she could do. The reality was serious, but Dolly never allowed illness to completely define her public identity. And there was a reason she fought so hard to keep that identity intact. Dolly Parton understood better than almost anyone how powerful an image could be. For decades, she presented herself as funny, generous, hardworking, and almost impossible to discourage. But that image wasn't simply a character she created for television. It reflected the way she approached life. She grew up with very little, entered the music business with enormous ambition, and built a career that eventually expanded far beyond singing. When hardship arrived, her instinct was usually to turn it into something productive. That mindset helped explain why she kept talking about future projects even when her health was deteriorating. She didn't want her final chapter to be defined by what her body could no longer do. She wanted it defined by what she could still create. That distinction matters because Dolly's legacy isn't limited to the songs people remember. She built places, programs, businesses, and opportunities that could continue without her. In many ways, she had been preparing for a world without Dolly long before anyone realized it. And one part of that legacy may prove more important than all the awards she ever received. Dolly Parton's legacy was never limited to a recording studio or a stage. Her career stretched across music, film, business, television, and philanthropy. Songs like Jolene and 9 to 5 became part of popular culture, while I Will Always Love You reached generations far beyond country music. But Dolly also built Dollywood into a major attraction and turned her success into opportunities for other people. That matters, because her influence didn't disappear when she stopped performing. It became something much larger. Even during her final year, she was still thinking about projects that could continue without her standing in front of a camera. And one of those projects had already changed millions of young lives. Among Dolly's most meaningful achievements was the Imagination Library. What began as a personal effort to encourage children to read grew into a massive literacy program, providing free books to young children. Dolly understood what it meant to grow up without much, and she wanted children to have access to something she believed could change their future: books. The program became one of the clearest examples of how she used her fame for something beyond herself. Long after people stopped listening to a particular song, those books could still shape a child's imagination. That may be why the program became such an important part of her legacy. And after her death, her family made a decision that showed exactly where they wanted the world's attention to go. Dolly's family chose privacy for her final farewell, rather than turning her death into a massive public spectacle. Reports indicated that arrangements would remain largely private, allowing relatives and close friends to grieve away from cameras. Supporters were also encouraged to honor Dolly through donations to the Imagination Library, rather than simply sending flowers. It was a fitting request. Dolly had spent decades redirecting her success toward other people, especially children. Even in the aftermath of her death, the focus was being placed on something that could continue helping others. Her final chapter wasn't being framed around celebrity. It was being connected to the work she cared about most. But there was another detail about her plans that makes her death feel very different from a typical farewell. Dolly had apparently been thinking about the future long before anyone expected she would need to. Her team has revealed that she prepared plans for projects that could continue after her death, including music and other creative work. That means audiences may still hear Dolly's voice and encounter her ideas in the years ahead. In a strange way, the entertainer who spent her life creating new beginnings had prepared for her work to continue without her. It also shows how seriously she took her responsibilities as an artist. She wasn't simply producing content for the moment, she was building a catalog that could outlive her. And that brings us back to one of the most important things Dolly always tried to control: the story she told about herself. Dolly Parton understood the difference between being famous and actually controlling your own story. She had spent decades watching people speculate about her marriage, career, appearance, beliefs, and private life. Yet she rarely allowed outsiders to define her completely. Even when discussing her health, she chose what to reveal and when to reveal it. She could acknowledge a problem without giving every private detail away. That approach remained consistent until the end. Dolly didn't owe the public every medical detail simply because millions of people loved her. What she gave them was enough to understand that she was struggling while still allowing her dignity and privacy to remain intact. Now, with her voice gone, the remaining pieces of her final year carry a different meaning. And perhaps the most emotional part of the story is the one relationship that shaped nearly 6 decades of her life. For almost 60 years, Dolly Parton and Carl Dean managed something that seems nearly impossible in the celebrity world. They kept their marriage mostly to themselves. Carl didn't seek fame because Dolly was famous. He rarely appeared beside her publicly and stayed far away from the constant attention surrounding her career. That privacy became part of their story. Dolly could be one of the most recognizable people on earth, while still having a relationship that belonged primarily to the two of them. When Carl died in March 2025, that private chapter finally ended. Dolly later acknowledged that caring for him had caused her to neglect parts of her own health. She also spoke about rebuilding herself emotionally, spiritually, and physically after losing him. That doesn't mean grief caused her later illness, and it would be wrong to make that claim. But Dolly herself made it clear that the loss changed her deeply. For the first time in decades, she had to imagine her life without the person who had been beside her through almost everything. And that makes the final year even harder to understand. Dolly didn't hide the fact that losing Carl had affected her. At Dollywood, she spoke about being worn down and worn out, and described the process of rebuilding herself. Her words suggested that the emotional impact wasn't something she could simply brush aside. Yet she continued doing what she had always done: working, planning, creating, and trying to give people something positive to hold on to. That's an important distinction. Her grief and her physical illness overlapped, but there is no reason to claim one caused the other. What we can say is that Dolly was carrying both at the same time. She was navigating the loss of a nearly 6-decade marriage while dealing with multiple health problems and eventually cancer. To the outside world, she still appeared determined to keep moving. But determination doesn't mean the struggle isn't real. Sometimes the strongest people are simply the ones who keep going while carrying things nobody else can see. And Dolly kept going almost until the very end. Even when her health forced her to cancel appearances, Dolly's creative mind never seemed to shut down. She continued developing projects connected to her music, Broadway, entertainment, and her broader business empire. That determination had defined her career from the beginning. Dolly had never waited for perfect circumstances before chasing an idea. She built opportunities from setbacks and turned personal experiences into songs that millions could understand. During her final months, that same instinct remained. She continued thinking beyond the immediate moment, even as her body was making travel and public appearances increasingly difficult. In some ways, this may be one of the clearest signs of who Dolly really was. She didn't measure her life only by how many shows she could perform. She measured it by what she could create and what she could leave behind. That mindset explains why some of her projects may continue even after her death. She had prepared for the possibility that her work would have to speak for her one day. And now it does. Looking back, the story becomes clearer when all the pieces are placed together. Carl Dean died in March 2025. Months later, Dolly postponed her Las Vegas plans because of health challenges. Her sister publicly asked fans to pray for her. Dolly then tried to reassure everyone. She later revealed years of kidney stone problems and said her immune and digestive systems had been struggling for 2 or 3 years. Eventually, dizziness, dehydration, and medical treatments made travel more difficult. Then came the devastating confirmation that she had been battling cancer. None of those individual moments tells the entire story. But together, they show that Dolly's final year was much more complicated than the cheerful updates suggested. She wasn't simply having one bad week or taking a temporary break. She was navigating a series of serious challenges while still trying to protect her fans from unnecessary fear. Perhaps that's why the news felt so sudden. Dolly had spent a lifetime making difficult things sound manageable. Even near the end, she was still doing exactly that. Dolly Parton may be gone, but the world she built is still moving. Her songs remain. Dollywood continues. The imagination library continues, putting books into children's hands. Her stories, performances, business ventures, and unreleased work can continue introducing new generations to the woman who came from very little and built something extraordinary. Her final year reminds us that public figures can reveal only a small part of what they're experiencing. Dolly chose optimism without surrendering her privacy, and she kept creating even while facing circumstances she could not control. Her death closes one chapter, but it doesn't erase the decades that came before it. Perhaps that's the most fitting ending for Dolly Parton, a woman who spent her entire life creating things that would outlast the moment. She didn't just leave behind songs, she left behind places, books, opportunities, memories, and a body of work capable of speaking long after she was gone. And maybe the final surprise is this: Dolly Parton planned for her legacy to continue without her. So in a very real sense, this isn't the end of her story. It's simply the moment when the world begins telling it without her.